Welcome to our presentation on cloud computing for regulated life science environments. The topics that we will be discussing will be presented in 4 parts. The first part is characteristics of cloud computing. The second part will be considering whether to use cloud computing. The third part will be about what you should find out about your provider before you engage them. And the fourth part will be cloud computing issues and their influence on validation. So I think I'll turn it over to Leo, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for watching our presentation. This is the third of 4 parts, and here we're going to talk about what you need to find out about a potential cloud service provider before you engage them, and some questions you need to ask them, and some things you need to consider. What we've been seeing is that some cloud service providers try to use buzzwords to try to make their offerings sound good, and so today we're going to try to dispel some of those myths and gimmicks that are used. Let's start out with the history and stability of the CSP. You need to find out if the potential cloud service provider has ever had customers who've had to operate in the regulated world. Find out if the CSP understands the regulations that you need to comply with, or at the very least will be willing to try to understand them and to work with you to help you stay compliant. You should try to look for a CSP who is experienced in working in the regulated industry and who has a proven track record. Some of the first and very important questions you should be asking is whether the organization or its management understands the concept of managing quality and managing risk. What you may find at times is that some of these providers are focused more on the number of accounts that they have and how much money they can make versus what quality of service they're providing. Here we have some examples of standard questions that you should start off asking any provider. For example, how is your data segregated from other companies, and how is that data protected? And when we talk about protection, we have to remember that we not only have to protect ourselves against other customers or other clients of that company, we have to protect ourselves from the company itself in the event that if the company gets infiltrated by a rogue employee, how is your data protected from them? And of course, probably the most important initial step is to figure out if the CSP understands how you or how your company intends to use their technology. If they understand what your requirements are in terms of capacity, protection, and especially regulations. And here is where you can present to them your list of requirements that you already developed for your own IT department. They should be able to meet every single one of them. Going into even more detail, the CSP should be able to explain what mechanisms are being used to isolate each tenant's data. With private or community clouds, for example, this may be physical isolation. With public clouds, the segregation is probably going to be controlled by the virtualization software that the CSP is using. And if we talk about using software as a service, we'll need to look at how the data from each customer is being stored. Does each customer have their own database? Is it dedicated to them? Do they have a set of tables that they're allowed to access? Or is everybody's data commingled together? The idea here is that you want as many barriers between you and everybody else as possible. Also, we had talked about security, but I want to bring up monitoring and auditing as well. What we should be looking for is a robust security system that's also being monitored and checked on a regular basis. For the more detailed questions, you probably want your IT folks to interview their technicians and figure out the answers to these questions. You will need to look at the CSP's system performance and availability, how they mitigate risk of downtime with redundancy, what measures are in place for disaster recovery, and of course, security. When it comes to security, be sure to understand their approach to things like identity and access management, encryption of data, both in transit and at rest, physical security, intrusion prevention and detection, and even configuration management. You're going to want to have a solid understanding of their infrastructure and their approach to security. It's the consumer's responsibility to take due diligence in selecting their provider. You have to know your provider. One of the things that's very important is the right to audit. That is a must, especially for a company working in the regulated industry. Being able to audit the CSP gives you that level of security and that level of assurance that they're doing what they say they're actually doing. And besides that, we also need to remember that the FDA or any other inspector will want to audit our providers most likely. Some other things to consider, as we talked about before, quality system, whether the provider has a CAPA system. We need to look at their hiring practices and, for example, whether they do background checks, criminal investigations, urine screens, things like that. And if you really want to get down to the nuts and bolts, you can even go as far as to find out what their purchasing criteria is for their equipment. It could be very enlightening, for example, to find out that CSP is using third-rate routers to handle all of their traffic. Now let's talk about independent audits. Independent audit reports are a way for CSPs to demonstrate to consumers that they have sufficient controls in place to protect their data. But of course, not all audit reports are created equal, and it's important to know the differences. In the past, SAS 70 was the de facto standard to be audited to for a CSP, and that was replaced by SSAE 16 just last year. Today, there are two main standards to which audits are done, and they are the SSAE 16 and also Trust Services Principles and Criteria, or TSPC for short. For now, we're just going to say that these two standards exist, and on the next slide I'll explain what the difference is between them. When an audit is completed to either of the two standards, what results is a SOC report, and there are three SOC reports. There's SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. SOC 1 is done to the SSAE standard, and SOC 2 and SOC 3 are done to TSPC. What you will see in each of the completed reports is the auditor's assessment of the organization's controls with respect to the applicable standard. And again, we'll talk about exactly what each standard is used for on the next slide. As you can see here, SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports are both done to the same standard. And the difference is that SOC 2 reports actually outline the specific controls that the organization has to meet the goals of the standard. And SOC 3, some of the details are stripped out because it's meant to be it's mostly an advertising tool. A company can publicize their SOC 3 results without exposing any of their internal controls or any of their security mechanisms to the public. With any of the three SOC reports, there are two types of audits that can be done. There are Type 1 and Type 2. With Type 1 audits, what you get is the auditor's assertion of the fairness of management's description about their organization's controls for security and meeting standard. And with Type 2, it's actually done over time, usually about 4 to 6 months, and it's a continuous monitoring and audit of the organization's controls, which is a lot more reliable and effective than just a 1-day or 1-week audit. And now let's look at what the difference is between the two types of standards and the two types of audits. What happens with an SSAE 16 audit is that a CSP's management makes certain assertions about the controls that the organization has in relation to their finances. This is very important because this type of audit does almost nothing to check or monitor what we really care about when it comes to IT services. And what we've seen a lot is that CSPs will advertise that they've been audited to SSAE 16, and if you read their SOC 1 reports, you'll see that they do not address the key issues. On the other hand, SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports will reveal results of audits performed to TSPC standards, which address these 5 key points: security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. So if you're going to use independent audit reports to help in the selection criteria for a potential CSP, always look for SOC 2 or SOC 3 reports, and as we discussed on the earlier slide, you want that to have been a Type 2 audit, which is done over a longer period of time. And before we move on, I just want to point out that just because an organization has not undergone an independent audit does not mean that they cannot serve your needs. What SOC reports should be used for is as just one of the tools that you can use to help evaluate potential providers. One last thing that I would like to address before we wrap up this part of the presentation is the misconception that regulated companies cannot use cloud technology. We need to look at the cloud service provider as a vendor who supports our business. And as with any vendor, they require qualification. As we talked about earlier, we will need to audit them, assess their internal controls, look at their quality and CAPA systems, examine their internal policies and procedures, and take a look at how they audit their own vendors. Just remember that a CSP simply provides a product and a service, just like any contract research organization, software manufacturer, or a raw material supplier.
Thank you for your interest in our cloud computing presentation. We started Globio because we saw a lot of inefficiencies and waste in the industry. We exist to help make FDA compliance efficient and to lower costs. Our core value is value through innovation, and we not only believe it, we live it. Please contact us today and see how we can help you. Thank you.